just give us a brief overview of yourself so people can understand who
Okay.
you're talking to?
Okay. So my name is Tyrene Wright, and I am the author of that book called Booker T. Washington and Africa: The Making of a Pan-Africanist. And essentially, the book is from a different perspective. But first, let me just get into, I am a Tuskegee alumni. It's not the impetus of my research, but I am a Tuskegee alumni. I was a history major at Tuskegee in the Department of History. I earned a Bachelor of Science in History from Tuskegee, and I went on to earn a Master's of Arts in History, Modern African History, my specialization, and my concentration was liberation struggles in Africa. So that specific period where you have about 17 African nations move towards independence. And then I got my PhD in interdisciplinary studies, public policy. And in the case of my master's and PhD, I wrote 2 theses on Washington and Africa. So I wrote a master's thesis on Washington and Africa, and then I wrote my dissertation on Booker T. Washington in African policy, which really focused on the 2 cases that end up later on in this book, which were the Liberian crisis and the African exclusion measure, which are 2 policy cases that Booker T. Washington was involved in. I later on, a couple of years later, wrote the book, Booker T. Washington in Africa. And so just so I'm clear, the book is not the dissertation. It was a whole different production. And I wrote the book from start to finish with the premise that what this research meant is that Washington was in fact Pan-Africanist. And so that is something that is a shift in the dominant notion on Washington. We have about 100 years worth of history written in academia that said Washington was the accommodationist and Du Bois was the Pan-Africanist. And yes, what I'm saying is that I take nothing away from Du Bois, but Washington was in fact a Pan-Africanist in measurable ways, right? Because what he does is engage in 2 policy cases that actually produce some concrete results that were to the benefit of African people. And that's measurable, right? And so initially that was in the case of Liberia. He's the key negotiator who was actually able to negotiate the fate of Liberia and change the outcomes in light of a crisis where Liberia was threatened to be annexed by 3 imperialist powers, the German, the French, and the British on the ground. And as we know, Liberia is one of 2 only independent African nations that had never been colonized at that point. The other case is the African exclusion measure, which would happen in 1915. And that instance, what happens is Booker T. Washington is paying attention to the congressional record, and attached to the larger immigration bill due to come before the Congress in January 1915, he notices that there is an amendment included in the larger immigration bill that would have excluded anyone of the African or Black race from the United States forever. And he directly challenged that, and he successfully was able to, through a number of ways, which I'll get into, he's successfully able to have the measure thrown out. And that actually impacts African immigration to the United States from that point to today, until today. Now, let me just say this about that case so you can understand. The scope of that case is really broad because while a lot of people would say, okay, it impacts African immigration, it really was meant to target immigration of African people and Black people coming from anywhere in the world. And it was actually directed not at Africa, but at African people who identify as Black or may not identify as Black, coming specifically from the Caribbean, Central and South America. And so he actually is the person who, can you all see that? I hope you can, because I have something on my screen. Hold on.
No, we can't see you.
Okay.
We can't see that, no.
Okay, no, I had something that just popped up on my screen. Anyway, so he is able to challenge that, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the case,
Okay.
how he does that and what channels he does, because it actually is unprecedented, right? But just to start, so those are my credentials, and essentially, I wrote this book because there needed to be a shift. Part of the reason why we are not able to benefit from the models that Booker T. Washington produced is because he has been largely maligned in academia. And there is about, like I said, 100 years worth of discourse in the academy that makes you not want to even delve into who Washington was or what he did, because it really is more about what he did, not so much about him as a person, as an individual, but he actually advanced the interests of African people. And he could have advanced the interests of any group of people, but he decided to advance the interests of the group that he saw himself as coming from. And certainly that was African people. He identifies with Africa and African people. So this largely is unknown. And to get into the context of the book, this is largely unknown because of the fact that you have a handful of scholars, one of which is Lewis Harlan, and he was the main biographer of Washington. He writes 2 biographies on Washington. He edits Washington's personal papers, all 15 volumes, and sponsored by the Library of Congress to do so. And he writes a number of articles. He spent 25 years theorizing about Washington, writing about Washington. However, he openly talks about the fact that he hated Washington. And so I talk about that in the preface of the book because of the simple fact that this has everything to do with the interpretation that we have about Booker T. Washington. First, it's Du Bois, but then that Du Boisian tradition produces a series of scholars, Van Woodward, and then eventually produces Lewis Harlan. So Harlan comes in the tradition of the Du Boisian scholar, and he seeks to define Washington and does so without challenge. So this really is about agency. This is really about our scholars having, not allowing a monopoly on the legacy of Washington, the interpretation of Washington, and also advancing, agency on behalf of African people, in the sense that Washington was in service to African people. And so therefore, we should be the ones who say whether or not he fulfilled that mission or failed. And we should be the ones to weigh and measure him, essentially. And so that's part of the premise of the book, in the sense that here is all the information directly coming from Washington's personal papers that is uncovered, but was always there. However, the historians that have been involved in interpreting Washington have been those who, probably were not qualified to, right? Because agents of another culture, of another people, right? And also the lack of insight and the unwillingness to engage in serious historical interpretive work, which would have allowed these theorists to do what theorists do, which is to attach meaning to social, political, and historical facts, behavior, and phenomenon. And so, there are people who come along and actually write significant articles about Booker T. Washington and his role in Africa. However, what unfortunately happens is that they decide to drop the ball on the interpretive side of the work to say, what did this behavior mean, right? So in other words, some of the research that I discuss in here, some of the historical facts that I discuss in this book in particular, are not things that are completely unknown. They're there in the historical record. However, scholars who have come along have gleaned across them and said that they didn't mean anything. And that was really problematic. I don't know how many of them came in contact or across the cases. And there are some that I mentioned in the preface of the book who talk about parts of, the Liberian crisis. However, a more complete, fuller picture where from A to Z, we examine all of Booker T. Washington's activity, relationships, role in Africa and with African people, that has never been done. So this is what this particular book comes along and does in terms of, its functional use, right? It examines all his personal relationships, correspondence, and his personal role via his own words through the Booker T. Washington papers, which were in fact his personal papers and correspondence. So if that makes any sense, right? So let me say it another way. The primary source of this book was not a bunch of secondary sources the main source of this book was not a bunch of secondary sources from scholars who had written over and again about Washington. The primary source of this book is Washington's personal papers, written in his own words, his own correspondence with various people, his private conversations with various people. And I do want to just point out, one of the reasons why this work may not have ever been done prior to this is because of the simple fact that Washington's papers are vast, right? His papers are vast. Even the part of his papers that have been edited by Lewis Harlan, that's vast. And there is about 1,000 boxes that are still unedited. So that remain unedited. So what Lewis Harlan did in editing Washington's personal papers was, edit what amounts to the 15 volumes. That is just a fraction of his correspondence that took place over the course of his presidency or his tenure as president of Tuskegee Institute. It still doesn't even represent the full picture. And what I did with this research is go to those 15 volumes and meticulously essentially lift everything connected to Africa, everything connected to any African national that was ever written in those papers. Okay, so anything related to Africa, anything related to any of the African nationals that he was in correspondence, I pretty much lifted all of that from there and examined it. And from that develops these cases, as well as a context too, because what I argue and the key argument of the book is that Washington underwent a serious transformation that allowed him in the last 5 years, or let's say 8 years of his life, to actively be a Pan-Africanist. So in other words, let me say it another way. Washington was in training. He was having a litany of experiences related to Africa and with African nationals. And all of those things were transformative to him, to the point that when he is presented with the opportunity to engage in the Liberian crisis, he is well positioned, he is well informed, he knows he has been involved in a case where there was a serious contradiction in what he thought should be done and what was actually done. So he had a opportunity to qualify his knowledge and understanding of the condition of African people on the continent. He had a chance to qualify how he could engage Africa and African people as a result of all of these experiences that led up to the Liberian crisis. He's able to apply all of that knowledge from his contact with African nationals and nationalists, I would say. He's able to apply all of that knowledge in the context of the Liberian crisis, and he's also able to apply that knowledge in the context of the African exclusion measure. And those are the key cases in this book, but not to take away from the fact that much of the book, based on his personal correspondence with numerous people, and that's the challenging thing about studying Washington. You're engaged in so much correspondence that has to do with people all over the world. I really don't know anyone who is simply a college president who would have this kind of scope, or should we say just Rolodex. I mean, he was communicating with a lot of people on a lot of different matters. And we do have to remember that this was a man who, unlike us, knew slavery. He was born into slavery. He doesn't even know his actual birthday. So he had the mark of being an enslaved person. So this is for him to be in contact, politicking, because he was a master politician, like he did, is just amazing. So I'll get into the crux of the book leading up to that, leading up to the cases now. But I did want to say that the source of this book are not secondary sources. The sources are not secondary; they are primary. And of course, secondary sources are used to corroborate the facts, the historical facts, and give context. However, this is all coming from Washington's personal papers, and it took a very long time. I don't want anybody to think that I wrote this book overnight. It's a small book, but it is a result of just many years of research that sort of culminated at the point of writing this book. But prior to that, like I said, I had written 2 theses on the book, one of which was a dissertation, on the subject matter, right? One of which was the dissertation, and was not as in depth as the book, and was certainly not from the perspective that the book is from, right? So the book is not a dissertation, not by a long shot, and nobody wants to read dissertations anyway. They're boring. So just to get into, let me just frame some things so people can understand something really important and critical. I mentioned Lewis Harlan, and like I said, my criticism, even though now this book came out 5 years ago, so I've moved on from this work in the sense that even though I think it'll be important forever, because it's important to understand what Tuskegee was and how someone like Booker T. Washington built and navigated it and shared it with the African world, more importantly. But, there is something that African scholars, African theoreticians in the United States in particular allowed to happen with this book. And that, with this research, on Washington, which is that, once again, I can't, stress enough, there was a monopoly, and we should never allow a monopoly to take place with regard to our leadership here in the United States. We should be, whether they failed or succeeded, we should be the first ones to define their legacy, the people they serve. So, and that takes great courage. Whether, if they failed, you've got to be honest enough to say, hey, they failed us. And if they succeeded and gave us some tools to navigate this world or to problem solve with, then we've got to be honest about that. But it is never the job of other people or other cultures or people from other cultures, agents of other cultures, to define our leadership. So that's one of the guiding principles and thoughts of this book, that this is our work to do. And we dropped the ball, and we allowed 100-year discourse to take place in the academy and go unchallenged. And that is, very harmful, because the undoing of that is a very slow process. And of course, a lot of people, most people don't want to do it. It did something. I do want to explain this one point. What it did with regard to Washington is that it maligned him so that our scholars won't touch him. So it made no one want to investigate, because the interpretation or the words of other scholars had already set the tone for who Washington was, and so we believe that, and that is, a disservice to us, right? Because we are not able to invoke the models that he left for us. We are not able to take the good from what he did for us. And there's a great amount, right? So I'll get into that. But what I wanted to I'll cite a couple of things from the book that are in the preface, and they have to do with just this particular issue. And I don't want to spend forever on this issue, so I better start timing myself. But I don't want to spend forever on this issue, but I do want to just, address the issue of Lewis Harlan and how that comes about, and what I say about that in this book. So what I detail in the book is simply this. Lewis Harlan, unlike anyone else in history, had the rare opportunity to monopolize the interpretation of an African-American icon and leader. The travesty is Harlan's work has gone unqualified, unchallenged, and beyond reproach. Lewis Harlan openly admitted and discussed his general disdain for Booker T. Washington. In Booker T. Washington, A Reexamination, historian Robert Norrell sheds some light on the issue in his essay, The Legacy of Tuskegee. So this is another scholar who actually, was trying to do corrective work around the fact that Harlan had a monopoly on Washington. And so Norrell says that Harlan was a very talented historian and a fine writer who has an amazing hostility to Booker T. Washington. One wonders why a person who is so negative and so hostile towards a historical figure would choose to write a biography about him. Lewis Harlan will tell you that he began a study in the 1960s with the assumption that Washington was an Uncle Tom, that he was a sellout, and then he worked on research and writing about Washington for the next 25 years. He said that along the way, he became more respectful of Washington because he wasn't purely a sellout, just a sneaky, underhanded man. So that in essence, that was Lewis Harlan, who wrote 2 biographies on Washington, edited 15 volumes of his personal papers, and wrote a litany of articles, academic articles on Washington. That is what he essentially said. That he didn't hate him anymore. He just realized that he was just a sneaky, underhanded man. And that is the person who had hands on a leader like Booker T. Washington's legacy, okay, and had a lot to do with every interpretation you see in the 20th century produced about Washington. So dubbing him the accommodationist and all of that. No doubt he wore a mask. However, the interpretation that doesn't allow people to delve into what Tuskegee really was is something that is put forth primarily by Harlan. And it does begin with Du Bois, and I'll get briefly into that. But Harlan is the person who gives it life in the academy, and scholars, primarily white American liberal scholars, give it life for at least 100 years, embellishing this whole Du Bois-Washington programmatic difference argument, which is really smoke and mirrors, okay? Because Du Bois himself later admits that there was not really that much of a programmatic difference. Tuskegee was not a vocational and industrial school, but it's in fact a school for teachers that also prepared those teachers to teach the academics and to industries as well. So, and Du Bois would have known that because he is on the campus of Tuskegee on many occasions. He solicited Washington to hire him for a job on at least 3 occasions, and 2 are documented in the book. And it's not cursory conversations. He's in depth about what he thinks he can contribute to Tuskegee in terms of research. And he was also fully aware of the fact that from its inception, Tuskegee offered the discipline and the subject matter of history as part of its curriculum. Vocational and industrial schools that are purely just that don't offer that, okay? That's irrelevant. World history and so many other things that let you know pedagogy, right? You don't need pedagogy as a industrial or vocational ed person. You need pedagogy if you plan to teach. And that's in fact what Tuskegee was, a school for teachers. So I'm not going to go any further on that, but essentially you get the understanding that, well, let me just say this one last thing. Norrell also says that it's remarkable, and I'm quoting, it's remarkable to see the ways that the Du Boisian interpretation of Washington is almost entirely adopted by scholars. Essentially, whatever Du Bois said about Washington is embraced by Van Woodward, and then by his student, Lewis Harlan, and then by subsequent scholars. By now, almost 2 generations of scholars writing about American race relations have essentially followed what Du Bois said and adopted his very biased view of Washington. It is remarkable. I'm not aware of any other historical circumstance in which one person who is the avowed enemy of another historical figure gets to essentially establish what the historical reputation of the other person is. And so that's how we only know Washington as the accommodationist. And I think it's actually, there's a bit of irony in that, because what happens is you have a cadre of scholars who try to make us think that they favored the more radical, direct action and protest tradition, scholar, activist Du Bois, more than they would have favored someone who was not asking for social and political rights. And that's not quite true on either, meaning that wasn't quite Washington's position. However, he did allow that view that he was not going to press for social and political rights to prevail. However, the scholars who give life to this Du Bois Washington programmatic difference would like you to believe that white America loves the radical black person more than they like the assimilationist, the accommodationist, and someone who is not going to ask for social and political rights. It doesn't make any sense, and it's simply not true, um, which is, part of what I address here. So let me just get into the founding of Tuskegee and who Washington is. So two things that I framed this book with is the context in which Washington becomes a Pan-Africanist. Where does he get these ideas from? Does he have these ideas at all? Where is it coming from in terms of his own ideation? And his context is his mother. The other idea that I framed the book with to a large extent is this idea of perfecting the Tuskegee model, which is what he would share with the African world. So just think to yourself, once you master something, when you have something that you value, what do you do with it? You share it with the people you value most, right? This is why people transfer assets to people they love, right? When they go on, to their next journey, when they transition. So Washington is seeking to do just that. He has this sense of, he has a desire to know and understand Africa. And he writes about this in The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. And what he does is tell the reader of The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery, that his first desire and his first indication that what he was told about Africa and African people was wrong was his mother. He said essentially that a people who could produce a woman such as his mother had to have some good in them that geographers failed to discover. And so he does not believe the dominant narrative about Africa being a wretched place and the people being equally wretched. And so he goes in pursuit of an understanding of Africa. He asks people, but when he gets to the point where he can read and when he is able to study on his own, he pursues this knowledge himself. And he learns quite a bit. If you want to know anything about what he learned, it's in the book called The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery, which was published in 1909. The reason why most people don't know about this particular book is because of the fact that at the time you have this public programmatic difference between Du Bois and Washington, which, like I said, is really smoke and mirrors. However, the book, The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery, is an autobiographical sketch of African people from home, and he calls Africa home in this book, to America. And he attempts to tell the story of African people much in the same way he had told his story in Up from Slavery. And so that's really what the story of the Negro is about. It's about African people, African culture in every context. And it is a very in-depth look at African people, to the point where you would really be impressed by his level of knowledge, in-depth knowledge about Africa and the African continent and the multitude of ethnicities that inhabit the African continent. Then and now, this knowledge is actually viable, but he is very knowledgeable at this time. He writes the book somewhere around 1900, but the book doesn't get published until 1909. However, the book is dismissed because of the fact that it does not talk about social and political rights and integration into American society. And that is what most people wanted to hear about, right? And rightfully so, because This is post-Civil War. This is after the rollback on radical Reconstruction. And so people are saying, like, listen, we spilled our blood in this war, and we want to collect every part of what we fought for, right? Social and political rights, equal protection under the law, and at the time, we understand that Dred Scott decision had been made. And of course, you had Plessy, you had the Plessy Doctrine, which was the law of the land in the United States, separate but equal, right? As a result of Homer Plessy's case. So they're not trying to hear you reminisce about Africa and how good it was for us and our culture there and what it all meant, and your personal feelings about African culture, African people in numerous contexts, and then our journey here. But that is what he's talking about, and that is a large text that he writes on the subject matter. In that book, he also talks about how he comes to know Africa through his mother. And so then you can see that he is identifying his mother as a representative of African people and African culture. And he, is very explicit about his affinity, his deep love and respect for the people as a result of his mother being a production of this culture and people. And so, like I said, that is missed by larger American society and the readers of this book, or maybe the people who failed to read the book as a result of the fact that it was not about social and political rights in America. That being said, this is where his I guess you can say his Pan-Africanist sentiment lies in his writings. And so later on, what also happens is that he expresses that he always, and this is also in the story of Negro, he also always had the intention to go to Africa. And he only knew the missionary context, and he was not a very religious person. And we know that in a number of ways that he wasn't very religious, because when given the opportunity after Tuskegee is established, the chapel is not the center of religious ideology. It is, in fact, a center for discourse around character building. The lectures that Washington would give in the chapel on Sundays were not about religious ideology or even Christianity or any other particular religion at the time. They were largely about character building, and that is an African tenet. Okay? Character, right? As being something that we must build and strive for. So he identifies his desire in the story of the Negro, the rise of the race from slavery, that he wanted to go to Africa, but he had only known people to go to Africa as a missionary. And once he becomes the leader of Tuskegee the Tuskegee Normal School, and or the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee, it's called initially, he realizes that he's not going to make it to Africa. He is too bound up and obligated and entangled in his responsibilities at Tuskegee. But this gives us deep understanding and insight into why he would then seek to export models of Tuskegee to Africa, and why he would get involved in a very controversial case with the Togo at the turn of the century. And there would be Tuskegee graduates sent to engage in an expedition in the Togo in conjunction with the German colonial regime. So he actually begins to live vicariously through his students. He actually begins to live vicariously through his students in his desire to get on and get to and engage the African continent and its inhabitants. Okay. So, I'm basically giving you the framework of what would lead Washington to be a Pan-Africanist. And so there's a whole chapter in the book called Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist. And basically it covers everything I just said, but more importantly, it covers his personal relationships with two of the most important Pan-Africanists of his time, which were Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. And a lot of people do not know that Marcus Garvey's desire to come to the United States was provoked by his desire. His desire to come to the United States was provoked by an invitation from Washington and a conference held at Tuskegee in 1912 called the International Conference on the Negro, which opened up Tuskegee's 44 industries to the African world and people involved in Africa, as well as administrators who were involved in Africa. But it essentially was meant to export some of the models and the industries that existed at Tuskegee to the African and throughout the African world, to Africa and throughout the African world, because at this time Tuskegee is a hub for international students, primarily from the Caribbean, Central and South America, which is very interesting. But more importantly, it becomes a hub for African students, meaning Washington has a steady flow of African students from the African continent that come to Tuskegee from 1893 on, right? So in this chapter, I talk about his role and relationship with Du Bois, and I talk about his role and his relationship with Marcus Garvey. So I just want to get into a little bit of that. And listen, you're really challenging me today with this, because normally I do a slide presentation with this, so I'm just getting prompted. So you're making me, you're having me just go off the dome with this information, which is fine because it's organic to me. It's what I did for a long time, and so I'm just going to jump into a little bit of this, also too, I'm gonna show you how I framed the chapter with this quote by Washington that most people would think would come from someone like Du Bois, and it didn't come from Du Bois. It came from Booker T. Washington. So I opened this chapter on Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist, with this quote. There is, however, a tie which few white men can understand, which binds the American Negro to the African Negro, which unites the black man of Brazil and the black man of Liberia, which is constantly drawing into closer relations all the scattered African peoples, whether they are in the old world or in the new. I have rarely met in America anyone of my race who did not, in one way or another, show a deep interest in everything connected with Africa. The millions of Negroes in America are almost as much interested, for example, in the future of Liberia and Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, as they are in their own country. There is always a peculiar and scarcely definable bond that binds one black man to another black man, whether in Africa, Jamaica, Haiti, or the United States. And that is Booker T. Washington. That's a direct quote from his book, The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. Actually, you can find it on page 20 of the book. But I used that quote to open up the chapter on Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist, because it shows that, and some people challenge, whether or not, hey, have you seldom met anyone in America who does not wonder about Africa or does not find a deep connection? Some people don't believe that, but essentially the point is that whether he believed that or not, he was very clear and very specific about the connections he saw via the African population on the continent, in the United States, in the Caribbean, Central and South America, and throughout the world. And he's explicit about it. If you are interested in that, you should read the story of the Negro, because he goes further in depth about that particular notion. But latter part of the book, I get into the relationships that he has with people like Du Bois, and I'm gonna time myself. I'm gonna give a little 5-minute speech on Du Bois and Washington, only because I think that all too often this is something that's belabored. The point is belabored. The facts are there. If anyone before me wanted to uncover, dispel, destroy the myth of this conflict between them, they could have. I think, it's almost like any conflict. When once it happens, then other people who are not involved in the direct conflict have an investment, are invested in the conflict. And that is what happens. This pseudo conflict between Du Bois and Washington. I say pseudo because it wasn't really an authentic conflict. And Du Bois talks about that later on. And it is in this book, if you're interested. It is in this book as well, but it's also found in an essay, which I will give the citation for. But Du Bois talks about the fact that this programmatic difference was not his real issue with Booker T. Washington. He's very clear about that. He writes it in another essay. However, what he does explain is that he chose to say there was a programmatic difference because he did not want to discuss his generational issue with Booker T. Washington in the public realm. Okay? And what was at the core of this generational issue was Washington's views, and in Du Bois' interpretation, possibly of abuse of his secret network called the Tuskegee Machine. And the Tuskegee Machine was a series of power brokers that were all loyal and part of Washington's network that he utilized in order to do a number of things. There's great irony in the story and the use of the Tuskegee Machine, because this same issue that Du Bois has with Washington, which is really the source of his conflict with him, turns out to be the very tool, the Tuskegee Machine, that Washington uses to undo the African exclusion measure. And Du Bois is aware of, and he's opposing the African exclusion measure. However, what separates Washington, Du Bois, Trotter, and others in light of the African exclusion measure is that they had no power to stop the African exclusion measure. They had no vehicle to stop it. They had no measure of power to stop it. And Washington, on many levels, attempted to stop the African exclusion measure, but definitively, it is the Tuskegee Machine, that the individuals who are part of this machine that go to Washington and directly challenge American politicians on this measure, and successfully so. The details are in the book. It's a very interesting story. However, this vehicle, the Tuskegee Machine, is what Du Bois is really upset about, because part of how Washington used it was to silence younger leadership, younger Black leadership that did not necessarily agree or fall in line with what he saw should happen in the public realm. And so Du Bois was very angry about that. It is the classic junior-senior conflict, right? And it was classic generational conflict. Washington had a lot of power. Du Bois, at that stage in his life, had really no power for most of the time that Washington is alive. He comes into some measure of power as a scholar activist, but he does not have any power in white institutions, and he struggles with power in Black institutions, right? His last institution is Clark Atlanta University. So he does not amass any real serious power to change social and political dynamics of the United States in a major way, meaning directly influence them. So, and let me say it another way, Booker T. Washington had what we call soft power. He had soft and unconstituted power. He had power that was given to him by the people because he was affirmed as leadership. But he also had some hard power in the form of the Tuskegee machine, not because he was appointed, but because this network of people were in place and in positions where they could maneuver and influence things. And so Washington is able to use his soft power on many occasions, and he's also able to influence people who have hard power. For example, there are a number of people who are the head or the editors of the Black press. And everyone knows that at the time, Washington had significant control of the Black press, all except Monroe Trotter's paper, right? Other than Trotter's paper, he has heavy influence on what would be printed in the Black press up until his death. And he uses this. He's not seen, but he certainly is maneuvering behind the scenes because some of these people are in his network and they're obliged to carry out his desires. I don't want to embellish that too much, but let me get on to the Du Bois Washington conflict. I start, analyzing the relationship between the two with the first letter Du Bois ever wrote to Booker T. Washington. And listen, I can't give it all the way in this interview or in this in this sit down. However, I'm going to give you some key points, and you can go and explore for yourself the book or related documents and collections. But I document the first letter Du Bois writes to Washington primarily because of the fact that it needed to be seen. So much has been written about their relationship, and most people don't ever get a chance to see what they were saying to each other. And the fact of the matter is prior to the publication of The Souls of Black Folks, published in 1903, Du Bois and Washington had a very amicable, friendly, and even close relationship, I would say, because Du Bois stays in Tuskegee on numerous occasions at the Washingtons' house. The Washingtons being Margaret Murray Washington and Booker T. Washington. He is a friend. Washington considers him a mentee, and they have a very close relationship. And the reason they are able to have this close relationship is because of this first letter, which gives you an indication. And I'll read the first part of the letter, which says, and this is from Du Bois to Washington. It says, "President Washington, sir, may I ask if you have a vacancy for a teacher in your institution next year? I am a Fisk and Harvard man and have just returned from 2 years abroad as scholar of the John F. Slater Trustees. My specialty is history and social science, but I can teach German, philosophy, natural science, classics. Your wife knows of me, and I refer by permission to President Gilman, Johns Hopkins University." And what he's talking about, first and foremost, is that, one, you can see that he's asking Washington for a job, so that actually answers the question there. Was he asking teach it at vocational school. Certainly, they're not so concerned, and I'm not, this is not to negate any vocational industrial school. This is just to say, I don't know the importance of history. I don't know the importance of social science, classics, or German for that matter at an industrial and vocational school. However, Du Bois offers those things because he knows that some of those things are already being taught at Tuskegee, which is the school for teachers, not solely, not an industrial or vocational school. The charter in 1881 lets you know that it is a school for teachers. And then when Washington makes the institution independent, I'll get into that, the charter says it is a school for teachers. Okay, so there's no mystery about that. That's a myth that Tuskegee is a vocational and industrial school, not a fact. But you can see here that Du Bois references Washington's wife. Why? Because Margaret Murray Washington, in fact, attended Fisk University at the same time that Du Bois is there. So he is acquainted with her, and he tells Washington as much. And of course, few people know this, but Margaret Murray Washington and Du Bois maintained their relationship even after Washington dies. So that right there should give you some questions if the relationship was truly as venomous as many people say it was. But nonetheless, Du Bois is asking for a job. He says, hey, your wife is my reference. She knows of me, but also this person at Johns Hopkins knows of me as well. But he's asking for a job. And then later on, he, just for the disbelievers, I include another letter that is more specific shortly after that indicates that Du Bois had some serious intentions in terms of doing research at Tuskegee and making Tuskegee his base, because certainly he did want to put the study of the African person in the American context on a more scientific terms. He was looking for a place to do that. He thought he could do that at the University of Pennsylvania. I don't think it worked out like that, but he does produce the Philadelphia study, the study of the Philadelphia Negro, right? So he does get into what would seem like a sociological perspective or a sociological study of the African population in Philadelphia. But even before he gets there, he is talking to Washington about his plans on how to do this on a larger scale at Tuskegee and how to make this part of the program, right? So part of Tuskegee's curriculum, so to speak. He writes, and this is from Du Bois. I'll tell you when he, I can't tell you the date, but this is actually in the Booker T. Washington papers. And actually, if you get the book, you'll see the citation. Nonetheless, it is part of the Booker T. Washington papers, and this is the actual letter. Quote, "Dear Mr. Washington, I feel I should like to work at Tuskegee if I could be of service to you. My idea has been that there might gradually be developed there a school of Negro history and social investigation, which might serve to help place more and more the Negro problem on a basis of sober fact. I think that in time, various colleges like Harvard, Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and the UPenn would join in supporting such a movement. What do you think? At the present, I just know how I could be of service. I can teach most primary and secondary branches, preferring, of course, history, economics, social problems. Same as he says before, I have had an indication that I may possibly expect an offer from the University of Pennsylvania for a year, after which, if needed, I could come to Tuskegee perhaps, have the active aid of a great institution like UPenn. In any case, I am willing and eager to entertain any proposition for giving my services to your school." That's a rough reading, but the point is that, his intention after his year at the University of Pennsylvania is to come back to Tuskegee and establish a scientific study of the African experience here, or so he said it in the other term, the Negro, right? So this is his second correspondence, not second correspondence to Washington, but the second correspondence in which he writes and asks for a job, employment. And he's fully aware, like I said, that this is not a vocational and industrial school. Because if that is the case, why are you asking for a job? You're not talking about wheel writing. You're not talking about the printing press. You're not talking about the industries that you're skilled in. You're talking about engaging in a scientific study of the African experience in the United States, right? And you look for a home, an institution to house that study, that scientific study. That is not of a Western nature, right? So in other words, a non-white institution to do this, right? So